Having a Gas is the podcast that talks the great and the good of the creative industries, and in particular finds out what makes great music for film, for TV, for commercials, for dancing to, for cooking to, for f***ing to, and more. Today I'm having a gas with Bill Schnee, a veteran recording engineer who has worked with Barbara Streisand, Marvin Gaye, Ringo Starr, John Lennon, Whitney Houston, Carly Simon, Rod Stewart, Miles Davis, Kiki Dee, Martha Reeves, Neil Diamond, and the list goes on. So we were just talking off mic about Andrew Sheps, and he was on the podcast recently, and of course he was well aware of you, and you're aware of him. What have you done with him?
Well, I did his Andrew interviews Awesome People most recently, but other than that, we've shared some exposés, at AES. Been on panels together.
Yeah, so sharing wisdom, sharing knowledge, but I imagine considering the caliber of some of the people you've been able to work with, do you get sought out for your opinion and for that kind of thing quite a lot?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
I suppose so.
Okay, so I suppose a good way of starting might be to say that, well, you've got a book that's out now, or is it coming out soon, did you say?
No, yeah, it came out in March, Chairman at the Board, recording the soundtrack of a generation.
And so for people in our industry, the advertising industry in the UK, who might not already be aware of you, how would you describe your career in a nutshell?
The producer-engineer. How's that?
Producer-engineer. And I've got some of the artists you've worked with in front of me here, including Ringo Starr and indeed all of the Beatles. We've got Marvin Gaye, a lot of work with Motown, Steely Dan, mixing for Miles Davis, George Benson, Whitney Houston. It's an impressive resume.
Yeah, very, very blessed career. Very fortunate.
So why don't we discuss how you got started? How did you begin?
Okay. My senior year of high school, I've met some guys that were starting a band. And as a musician, I started off on trumpet and then went to sax and then finally keyboard. These were lessons that I took in grade school and into junior high. And so I asked if they thought an organ would fit in with what they were doing. And they said, let's give it a go. And so we did it. And that's the LA Teens. I'm sure everyone remembers. Well, no, I guess not. Anyway, we were very fortunate. We played around town wherever you could in those days. And we started writing songs that were, somewhat juvenile, but kind of nice in their own way, hooky. And we saved our money and went into a little local studio and put down 4 songs. And one of the band members' mother knew someone who knew someone that was in the music business. And that someone was Gary Usher. And Gary was good friends with the Beach Boy Wilson family. In fact, he wanted to be a Beach Boy, but didn't make that. However, he did write In My Room and 409 with Brian. And he had had been doing Hot Rod records, which were at the time. This is 1964. And he got a production deal with Decca Records. And so he was signing some acts, and he signed the LA Teens. So we went and recorded at 2 of the best studios in Hollywood to this day, Capitol and Western, which is now called East West. And we did, in those days, you did 4 sides. And if you managed to get a hit, you ran in and cut 6 more quickly and put out an album. Sadly, there was no LA Teens album. But on that first recording session, he had brought in, for an overdub, a session guitarist named Richie Podler, who was an astounding musician. And as it turns out, also an astounding engineer and producer. And so when we got dropped, I went to Richie's studio and told him the sad story. And he said, oh, you guys were great. I can get you another record deal. And he did. And we went into his little studio, American Recording, which was kind of funky, but we cut our first track. And when I came in the control room, as he was playing back on the 604, Altec 604Es and utility cabinets, I looked up at those speakers as it was playing, and it was a real defining moment in my life, a real aha moment, because I'd never heard the emotional impact that the sound he was getting could make on our band. And again, after recording in really good studios at the time. And when the track was over, I turned to him and pointed at all the equipment and said, "Can you teach me how to do this?" And he said, "No, I'm teaching Cooper. Get out there. Let's do it. Take two." I said, "Okay." But that was the moment that I really, wow, I want to know how to do that.
Now that is a profound moment for all bands who get into the studio for the first time. And when someone has captured your sound, either as you had it in your head or even better, that moment you described is a very common thing. And I'm sure you've seen that when have you frequently engineered people for the first time and been able to experience that moment for other people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It truly is amazing when you can hear and that what you've thought of in your head and been working on is actualized in a way that is appealing to you.
And so, how did you make the jump from that moment, from being basically 100% musician who had been struck by lightning at the desk, to becoming a full-time engineer? How long was that overlap and how difficult was it?
Okay, well, what happened was I went out and found a local studio where I was living. I started college. My dad was a Jewish doctor, which means there was a lot of pressure to be either a doctor or a lawyer. And I knew I couldn't be a doctor. So I started college, and then I had quit for 2.5 years while we chased the LA teens around to no avail. And but so I'm back in college, like a good boy, living with my parents, and I found this little Mickey Mouse kind of studio where I could get a start. And how Mickey Mouse was it? Well, he only had 2 professional microphones, 2 condenser microphones. He just had an 8-input mixer with no EQ and a spring reverb for echo, and egg cartons on the wall for sound absorption.
Oh, right.
And it was 2-track, only 2-track. And by then the standard was 4-track, getting ready to become 8-track. But the good part about that, of course, was everything was live. You mixed everything live. And so that's where I got a start. And finally, he came in with a homemade 4-track. Someone had made a 4-track out of a couple of 2-tracks and put a 1/2-inch head stack on it and whatnot. He brings that in, and I said to the owner, how are we supposed to do that with this little 8-input mixer? At which point he brought out another little 8-input mixer and set it on top of it. And I said, no, that's not going to work. We got to get something, a little more professional. And so he found this guy down in San Diego. I'm in Los Angeles at the time. And a guy named Toby Foster, he said he'd heard this guy knows electronics. And Toby came up and given the budget that we had for a console, he said, yes, I can make you a plate. It won't be professional electronics. It'll be PA quality stuff. So it might be a little noisy, but it should sound pretty good. And he built that console for us. And from there, Toby had heard what I was doing. And he was the first person to say, you're really good at this. And I just thought he was, blowing smoke. I didn't believe him for a second. But he definitely seemed serious. And he took a job in another studio, a real studio, as a maintenance engineer and disc cutting. And so what happened is I asked him if he could teach me what all this stuff really does, because the Mickey Mouse studio, there wasn't enough to learn from. And he said, absolutely. So we, every day after school, I would drive to his studio, and he was great, very patient guy. And I would just start in, okay, now, I'm sorry, what's a condenser mic again? And what's a dynamic mic and a ribbon and on and on and on. And he was so patient, and he would take as much as he could until he finally said, okay, good night, see you tomorrow. And that's how I got going. Well, where all of my aptitude was in math and science. In fact, I actually started college in aerospace. But where the left brain and the right brain met, all this engineering stuff came very, very quickly to me. And the owner came to me one day and said, we're moving to Hollywood. I said, I'm not ready to go to Hollywood with the big people, big time. And he said, no, you're ready. And so off we went. He had found a studio to rent to put our equipment in, this little console that Toby had built. And we put it in there and started doing sessions. Not very many because, it wasn't that great a studio, but it was right there with Gold Star, a very famous studio down the street in the same block, and Paramount Recording right across the street. And by now, Richie Podler and his American Recording, he had become quite famous as having the best rock studio in Los Angeles. And he was engineering Steppenwolf and Three Dog Night, their first two records. And he had an engineer that worked there that was leaving the business. And he had come to my Hollywood studio and visited. And I would go to his when he was doing sessions at American and, see how the big boys ran. And when he said he was leaving, I said, do you think Richie would hire me? And he said, well, he should. So we spent 2 months between this guy, Tommy, and myself working on Richie till the day finally came when he gave me my shot. And it was a sink or swim kind of situation. And I managed to swim, and that was it. So that was just two and a half years from the time I didn't know the difference between a limiter and an equalizer. So it was pretty quick ramp up.
2.5 years, quite impressively condensed. Which I presume, by the way, writing the book has probably helped to consolidate all of that memory into like a linear narrative.
Yeah, it was great doing it. I couldn't have done it without the internet. The internet was great because you look up different things and it would spark the memory and oh yeah, now I remember that, and so on. Yeah, it was wonderful. Although, I did find, as everyone should know, a lot of mistakes, misinformation on the internet. One of the funny ones to me was I did an album with the Jacksons. I actually went on the bus and traveled with them. I bet you want to read that book now.
Yeah.
And when we finished, we did them all up in the Northeast of America there. So the recording truck could get to the gigs quickly, night after night kind of thing. And when we finished the recording, the manager said, get to the next town that has some studios and start going over the takes. And funny enough, the next one was Nashville. And yet when I was online, I found the list of all the venues where they played on that tour, and Nashville wasn't on there. And I was at the Nashville show. I sat in the audience with a couple of friends. So yeah, there's mistakes, but.
Well, it's good to still be able to set the record straight, and the fact that this stuff isn't getting lost in history. And but there's so many things to jump off from what we've heard so far. So many things that I could pick up on and that are fascinating points of discussion. But one that just came up through that is you mentioned a recording truck. Now, I'm someone who has only been working with audio since, let's say, about 2013. So the idea of a recording truck is completely alien to me, but it sounds like, is that how you would capture and record live performances on the road?
Right. Yeah. The first one I did, I started with Barbra Streisand on her Barbra Jones Streisand album. I picked up in the middle of that album and did some recording and about half the mixing that hadn't been done. And right after that album, she was going to do a live concert at the Forum in Los Angeles. And the producer asked me to do it. And I'd never done one, of course. And it was kind of scary because it was a one-shot deal, meaning you go in the afternoon, you set up in the morning, you go in the afternoon while they're doing their sound check and get your sounds. And then that night is the concert. And you got to capture it right then and there. And it went fine, went very well. The album came out and did very well. And then about 5 years later, I did the same thing with Marvin Gaye, a live album in Oakland with Marvin Gaye. And that also was a one shot. And so of course the Jacksons, we did about, I think 6 shows, 5 venues to it in Manhattan. And so what you have in every one of those cases is a control room on wheels. Is basically what it is, with where you most typically share microphones with the house, and and they can come out quite good. You know, I did another one with Natalie Cole after the Unforgettable album that became a PBS show, and that one came out exceptionally well. They had been on the road and they were well rehearsed, and it worked great. Both the Streisand and Marvin were, neither one of them had been on the road working, so it was kind of dubious how they were gonna pull it off. But in both cases, and obviously they're both incredible artists, they both came off just great.
But neither one of them had been touring up to that point.
They had not been touring, no. In fact, the Marvin one has got, you want an interesting story, I find it interesting, is that I had done some mixing for Motown prior to that, and I was never given credit for what I had done. It was engineer so-and-so who was a Motown engineer, and then special thanks to Bill Schnee. And so I was a little perturbed about that, 2 or 3 albums worth of that. So when they asked me if I wanted to do this Marvin Gaye, and that had to be based on the Streisand album, I guess, I went in and spoke to Berry Gordy's right-hand girl, Suzanne DePass, and she told me all about it, that Marvin hadn't sung in several years and whatnot, but they had every reason to believe that it was going to be a great show and it was worth investing in this one-shot recording. And I said, okay, well, I just have 2 requests. And she says, not requests, 2 things that I want to happen. She said, sure, what are they? I want credit as recording engineer Bill Schnee, and I want a shot at mixing it. If Marvin doesn't want to use my mix, that's fine, but I at least want a shot at mixing it. And she said, absolutely. Well, 1 out of 2 isn't bad. So I did the album. I did record it. It did come off pretty darn well, and I didn't get a chance to mix it until about 15 years later. Motown had been sold, and they had a girl that was running the division they called Special Products Division. And I have no idea. I wish I'd asked her, because it's the most bizarre thing. I've never heard of it happening on a successful album. And she didn't know the history that I had asked to mix it and didn't do it. But she called me up and said, I've got an album with Marvin Gaye. It was live. I'm not even sure she knew I had recorded it. She said, I want it to be remixed, and I'd like you to do it. And I went, okay. And so over came the tapes, and it was great, because I pulled up the box legend. If you've only been at it that long, you didn't do analog, right? So on an analog tape box, inside there would be the track sheet, which had in that case, 24 tracks of audio, what they were, the horns and drums and this and that. And so I was looking and kind of laughing at because I don't have very good handwriting. And those days when I had to write everything, I would take my time, but I could still tell instantly it was my handwriting, because it doesn't really change. And evidently neither does your sense of humor. And in this, on this concert, which had an astounding, as good as you could get R&B band, just kick butt, the best you could get, and a big horn section and a small string section. And of course, in those days, that's mid-70s, we didn't have the clip-on kind of microphones that we have today to do that, which can save it. That's what I used on when Hell Freezes Over with the Eagles. I was on the string section, but we didn't have that then. So on the track sheet where it said strings, I had an asterisk, and at the bottom, the key for the asterisk said, good luck. And because indeed it wasn't a very good string sound with all the horns and drums and everything bleeding into it. But I did remix it. Of course, I happen to prefer my mix. I think it's better. Unfortunately, Marvin was no longer with us, so he never got to hear it. But
so on the technical things there, so you've got a string section with an enormous amount of bleed, and even when you've got all the modern digital stuff to work with, there's not much you can do about a problem like that. How do you work it in, or do you just keep it backed off all the way?
Well, like I said, back then, all I knew to do back then was use use as many mics sort of as I could and get essentially too close, because you don't normally mic a string section. You shouldn't, I don't think, mic a string section real close, but try to get as close as I could with all the string mics, and then make the best of it. And, they're in the mix there, but it's not, you could never use as much as you might want because of the bleed. Again, now that we have clip-on mics where every violinist or viola or cello, every string player can have this mic clipped on their instrument, that's much, much, much better. You can actually get, it's still going to have bleed, but because they're by and large, they're little omnis, kind of like the one over here that I'm using here to speak with you.
Yeah.
But it works much, much better.
And so the impression, the ratio of, string signal to bleed will be, preferable. It'll be more like 90-10 as opposed to, the other way around.
10-90, yeah.
So interesting. I'm probably going to disappoint a lot of our advertising people because they're not all music people, but I'm trying to lap up as much knowledge as possible here. And you were saying that you don't like to mic string sections close. And why is that?
Well, because that's not how they were created to be.
Yeah.
Basically, that it's the sound. Ideally, a string section. If we start and pared down, if we start with an orchestra, the orchestra is 40, 50, 60, 80, 100, however many pieces that should come at you as one thing. It's an orchestra. It is one thing. And so as a result, when I do orchestras, like for film scores, the 80 to 90% of the capture is with 3 omnidirectional microphones, about 10 feet approximately over the conductor's head. And if you're in a good room, and that's important, if you're in a good sounding room, that you're going to get a really good representation of the orchestra. Now you have film mics on things like the woodwinds that might not carry as well compared to the brass, which will typically be behind them and will carry just fine, that kind of thing. But that's what you want to do. So if you look at it as a string section, even for a pop record, I always tend to, when I started, I was miking, I think, a little too close all the time. And I had a room mic. And now, because I wasn't recording in as good a recording studios either, because the recording, again, has to have a good sound to it, has to not be too dead, so that the ambience of the room, it gives you something. And it can give, depending on the room, it can give you a lot. And you won't get that if you mic too closely. So today I will start with 2 or 3 mics, and maybe not, depending on what it is, maybe not like an orchestra where I might get 80 or 90%, but I'll get at least 50% usually from those room mics, if you want to call them that, the overall mics.
Yeah, so you said room mics in a kind of disparaging tone there, and I'm guessing that's because really they are the principal mics. They're not just a kind of an ambience if you're recording.
Right.
Yeah. So that on the orchestra, I don't know what you think about this. I've always felt like the arrangement of the orchestra, where the instruments are placed, and of course how the music is written dynamically, you could think of as the original approach to mixing before there was any method of capturing audio. It was actually pre-mixed in the composition.
Correct. Yeah, what I've always said is that the ifs. If you have a good orchestra, if the orchestra is in a good room, if you have well-written and well-orchestrated, especially orchestrated notes on paper, if you have a great guy with a baton that knows how to lead an orchestra, if you're not running from a click, if you have all of those things, those sessions are easier for me than a big rhythm section, because it's taken care of. Everything is taken care of. And one of the things you point out to stand on is in fact, how the instruments interplay with each other, the orchestration of it all. A good orchestrator knows not to have instruments climbing on each other. They stay out of each other's way so that certain frequencies don't build up. If only a lot of record producers could learn that, because a lot of record producers, especially younger ones, will start, with all the mid-range oriented instruments, like, excuse me, like piano or or synth sounds and guitar sounds and everything that are in the same range, and they just start competing with each other. And it makes it much harder to hear everything. If they could learn that orchestrating rhythm sections on pop records or R&B record is very important also.
So it sounds as if, this is really interesting in particular, it sounds as if I've always had a suspicion that in the 60s and 70s, to work in a music production environment, there was an absolute requirement to have good musical knowledge in order to work in that environment. You couldn't just be someone who understood, let's say, the desk and the microphones. If you were a producer in particular, is that accurate?
For the most part, there was the role of the producer. If you drop it back into starting like in the 40s into the 50s, and into the 60s, there were still definitely a lot of guys like that were corporate types, and they worked for the corporation, and they did usually know music for sure of some fashion, but they didn't get involved hands-on as much. I do think that that engineering back then, especially, and I've always said maybe I was born just a little too late, because that era that Al Schmidt, for instance, got to do so much more of than I've been able to do, of the Everything Live was just such a wonderful time, and they were they definitely, like if Sinatra records, all those kind of things were absolutely written out by an arranger. And you really had to know how to follow a score to know how to mix what you were going to mix, because even when it got to 3 and 4 track, you still were capturing the band, the orchestra, live on 2 tracks. So you literally, and that's what I do when I do a film score. You're literally sitting there turning the score and looking ahead to see, there's a flute section coming up here, and know that to raise the flute stem, as it were, up a bit so that it gets captured properly. All of that in today's world, of course, on multi-track, is much less important, because you can go back and remix forever. But I grew up in the era where you want to capture everything live. In fact, when I went to work for Richie Podler, as I said, the great engineer that he is, he told me, he said, and this was 8-track when I finally got working with him, and he said, I start mixing with the basic track. I'm already thinking about the mix. I'm trying to put everything together. And that comes from having lived in the stereo 3-track, 4-track days, where you didn't have another opportunity to make a decision. You made the decisions right now, mm-hmm. and period, over and out. And of course, I still tend to think that way when I'm producing something. I'm still thinking about making a lot of decisions. I've backed off a lot, because there's so many more options now that you can do after the fact. But I still think that's a really great way to approach recording.
Yeah, absolutely. I was brought into one of my first heroes of sound production, recording, and the whole area was Steve Albini. And he really preached the gospel of, you have to get the sound right before it comes into the microphone and before it comes onto the tape, because he's an analog guy, very, very devoted analog guy. And now, we work in a digital production environment. Everything is done in the box. Everything is created and mixed in the box. And what we've arrived at, in my opinion, is an era where people believe all problems can be solved in post-production, which relates to the string question. If we hear a very close, scratchy string, people, clients and the kind of people who work with us will say, well, can you put some reverb on it, and can you make some magic happen that will make it sound perfectly recorded?
Yeah. There's no question that, and it started, it's not just, now we are in an insane territory where we can make people that can't sing sound like they can sing. And, you can change everything from their intonation to the phrasing, anything and everything you want. But it really started with 16-track, where we saw engineers coming in that maybe weren't really gifted mixers, but it didn't matter because they could spend as much time as they wanted, mixing the 16 tracks. Excuse me.
What makes one a gifted mix engineer?
My personal opinion is, I really think that it's a gift of balance, of an innate thing, that it's just there. If I think you're born with it. It's it's like like a super talented musician that has a gift. You put he and another. And someone maybe not with that gift, some other gift, and you put them both in guitar lessons or piano lessons for 2 years, and at the end of 2 years, one of them sounds like he knows how to get around the guitar. The other guy is making you open your eyes and go, wow. And one of my really good friends, and Glenn Johns, speaking of, is it's all about balance and right now. And so I was fortunate to meet him early on when he came to America to master with my graduate mentor, Doug Sachs, world famous mastering engineer that that I learned so much from. And Glenn came over all through the 70s with all of his albums for Doug to master. And so Glenn and I became mates early on there. And I learned a lot from talking to him.
Well, I think anyone could learn a lot from talking to Glenn Johns. I mean, for the sake of our audience who might not know, Glenn Johns, I believe, was responsible for the thunderous drum sound on Led Zeppelin 4, When the Levee Breaks. Is that right?
I don't know, but he's just, his list of credits is stupid. It's just
Rolling
unbelievable.
Stones is on, yeah.
Yeah, he recorded the Stones before they were the Stones, and then the albums that I was with him, he produced the first 2 Eagle albums and Who's Next, and a couple of albums after that with the Who, and just so many, Ozark Mountain Daredevil, so many great records.
Yeah, I remember I was, to be fair, when I was first getting into audio, as I said, 2013, this is when I was 20 years old at university. And they had just installed a state-of-the-art, very expensive recording studio. The room it sounded horrible. But the engineer, because I was a bad drummer at the time, he said, we're just going to put, one mic overhead on the snare, one on the left and one on the kicks, called the Glyn Johns technique. Is that right?
That's correct.
And was that for saving space?
Which was not totally different than what Richie Podler in the United States was doing. It was very similar to what I learned from Richie when I got started. But Richie was still recording drums in mono back then. It was just basically, and he did use a snare mic. We did use a snare mic back then. Glenn didn't. And I remember it was kind of cute. I think it was after Who's Next that, who was the drummer in the Who?
Why have I gone blank? It's Moon, isn't it?
Keith Moon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keith did an album with somebody else and they put a snare mic on and he loved it. And so on the next album with Glenn, they got in a big fight over whether to have a snare mic or not. And Glenn's thing in stereo was about the size. And that really did help me too when I formulated my way of recording drums, which where I wanted both. And I wanted the size that less mics get, just like with the string section. You back off the string mics, you're going to get a bigger sound than if they're close. Same thing over the drum set with the 2 mics, the way he does it. And yet I wanted the in-your-face part of it. So I definitely kind of started with a snare mic, and then it was the early Elton John records that were done at Trident that where every drum and the hi-hat, everything had a microphone on it. And so I sort of took those 2 ideas and put them together to come up with what I came up with in the 70s.
Right. So you mentioned the early Elton John records there as being recording. Were you thinking Madman Across the Water and that kind of era?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite albums. I love that.
yeah.
But I'm really interested in this idea that you said fewer mics makes for a bigger sound. And I think if we didn't have this wealth of knowledge that we're now trying to preserve in the digital age by doing this very thing, you might be tempted to think that more miking everything would produce a bigger sound. But it seems counterintuitive that it doesn't. And why doesn't it?
Well, it depends on your definition of big. Because what I'm talking about is a wide landscape, a big landscape. Every mic on every drum gives that, it's in your face kind of thing. Here's the thing, as I wrote about in the book, I learned early on that I came to the conclusion that for the most part, we don't really make records that sound like reality, because I'm trying to think about what reality was as I was getting started. So for instance, how I had been taught, and every session that I ever went to in different studios, for instance, take the piano. What is the most natural sound for a piano? Our concert grand piano, a 9-foot piano, is been done that way so that it will project out into an audience. But we're in a recording studio, and is it, and is it more natural, just outside the box, or inside the box, where if you stick your head in, which is where the microphones most typically are, that's more natural? No, not really. Same thing with drums. What's more natural drums? If you stand back 15 feet, which is about as close as you ever want to get to a drum set, if you put a couple of mics out there like that, it fails. So the idea of what Glenn was doing, that was much more of a combination of that. But I look at it that we're making. I determined early on that it was more of a cartoon than a photograph, meaning that I could draw with sound whatever sounds good, feels good, and moves you emotionally, and don't worry about how real it is or isn't. And that's really how everything has developed. If you listen back to in the old days, and like again the 40s and early 50s with the bigger kind of ensembles that were done, where they were in good sounding rooms with very, very, very few mics and very little equipment to modify them. They talk about my friend Elliot Shiner talks about learning at A&R with Phil Ramone, and early on they had something like one Fairchild limiter and an EQP1A equalizer. And he said, but Phil hardly ever used them. He just, you went out and listened to what you're going to do, and you put the mics, and if it wasn't bright enough, you changed the mic. Simple as that. Or you change the angle of the mic, that kind of thing.
Of course. And being in a studio that had the luxury of a great mic cabinet as well means you can make those kind of decisions.
Yeah.
So I really like this analogy that you used of drawing a cartoon instead of taking a photograph. Interestingly enough, one of the first records that I remember coming out was, I was very young at the time, it was the Slim Shady LP by Eminem, because the singles were doing very well on the radio. It sounded cartoonish to me. They sounded like cartoon characters, which is just an interesting parallel. But where do you think that practice started? Because what I'm hearing in my head, if we're talking about non-naturalistic sounding things, I'm thinking of Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles. I'm thinking of that kind of thing where it's a clear soundscape that's been crafted rather than an attempt to record an acoustic environment.
Yeah, well, I think they would, in their quest for unusual and different, talking to Jeff Emmerich, they did a lot to go for that idea for sure, because this is a piano, but can we make it sound like something else? That kind of thing. And so they did a lot of that, to be sure, and that opened up a lot of eyes, opened up a lot of people, professional people's eyes, as you heard those great records with some very unusual sounds and relatively unusual use of things like compression, which had not been used anywhere near as much as they did.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. A recent guest we had on was Eric Valentine. I don't know if you're aware of him. Yeah?
Oh, I know Eric, yeah.
Yeah, he's great. And he was telling us that little history story about in that era, it was, until the Beatles, perhaps, it was unorthodox for the artist to meet the studio team, to go into the control room. And it was perhaps the Beatles who were, one of the first artists to think we want to go and try and manipulate from the other side of the board rather than just from in front of the mics. Is that accurate?
That sounds right. I've never thought of it particularly that way, but that sounds very correct.
So you, I believe, had the privilege of working at some point with all 4 members of the Fab Four. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. It was really wonderful. It was the idea. What I've determined is that the three guys decided to give Ringo a leg up. They kind of knew that their solo careers were probably going to do pretty well, but Ringo, not being the prolific songwriter that they were, they all chipped in to do something for Ringo, and it started with just Ringo and a band. Richard Perry had met Ringo while he was doing a Harry Nilsson record in England. Harry was good friends with Ring, and he introduced him to Richard Perry, and Richard got into some talks a couple of years later with Ringo and called me up and said, I'm going to do an album with Ringo. I'd like you to engineer it. And I said, great. So we started with just Ringo and a band, including Jim Keltner. I'll never forget, Richard called me and he said, and he wants to record with Jim Keltner. And I said, he's not going to play drums? And he said, no, with 2 drummers. I went, oh, I had never recorded 2 drummers. So, okay. And we didn't do it on all the songs, but on quite a few. Anyway, we started with that. We cut a song or 2. And then George came over from England and he heard what we had done and was into it. And he brought a song to the table that he had produced on Ringo in England called Photograph. And Photograph is a song about, the guy's lost his girl and all he has is a photograph. And George had recorded it quite somber and, a little bit on a dour side. And in discussions, we were, having a good time and it was up and everything. And Richard said, why don't we recut this with more of a Phil Spector wall of sound kind of thing. And so that's what we did on Photograph, which became the first single and the biggest one. And then at the end of the week, as I was leaving one night, Richard said, oh, by the way, John's coming in on Monday with a song for Ringo.
Wow.
And that meant that we had 3 of the Beatles were going to play with the 5th Beatle, not the quiet one, not George, the 5th Beatle playing bass, Klaus Forman. And that was, the whole week had been astounding. But that Monday, when he came in and sat at the piano, and Ringo had been the life of the party, and when George came over, the quiet one supposedly, he was very verbal. John comes in the room, and it was just like all of them, and it was whatever you want, John, and he was we knew when he was done, we would know it because he would say, that's the one. And it was great. And at the time, unfortunately, Mr. McCartney had a drug bust in the United States, and the United States, he was banned from coming over for 9 months or something. And it really is too bad because I really do think that if he could have come over, there's a chance there could have been a Beatle reunion. I think most of the bad blood had kind of dried up at that point, 3 years later. But the session with John was the only time after they broke up that the 3 of them ever played together again.
And you bore witness to that.
Yeah.
Wow. And so when you're working with an artist, this was a tack I was going to jump onto before, but this is the perfect time. I wonder, as an engineer, when you're working with great artists, with Barbra Streisand, with Marvin, and with John Lennon, how do you manage your stress and your anxiety to give them exactly what they want because they have this deity status?
Yeah. I was asked that recently. do you ever get nervous? And I certainly don't anymore. Now, on the early Barbra Streisand, the record, let alone the live record that I talked about, yeah, there were nerves flying. And with all of these Beatles, oh yeah. But it wasn't too long after that. I think I did No Secrets with Carly Simon, and I worked with, and this is all in the first 3 years of being a professional, so to speak, engineer, and I think it worked to my advantage because I got over that kind of thing. It's just they started to realize they're just people, and they put their pants on one leg at a time, or their dress on, and that kind of thing. So it changed me. On the other hand, as a musician, I popped so quickly that I was working with some of a lot of the very best keyboard players, right out of the box in my career, and as an engineer, and it was like I just gave up. I quit, which is unfortunate.
Well, as in quit
I still
as a
fool
musician?
around and have been some of my songs have popped up on different albums, but that's what I really thought when I got into the engineering. It wasn't about to be an engineer as much as it was to be able to do that with my band.
Yeah.
But kind of went a different way.
There are very few engineers or producers I've spoken to who didn't say that. That most of them report, and most sound designers in the film and all thing, they all come through music, and it all came from a dream to be the musician, be on the other side of the mic. I can't imagine how else you'd get into it, but yeah, you were talking about working with great keys players, and maybe some names can come out. Did you ever work with Billy Preston?
Oh yeah.
Wow, what'd you do with him?
Several times. He was on. I'd have to look at the credits. I don't know if he was on the first Ringo album or the second one, but that's when I met him for sure. Was on the Ringo album, and then I have a very good friend of mine that's a drummer, Bill Maxwell. Became very good friends with him. He did a lot of Bill produced a lot of Christian albums, and had worked a lot with Billy. And so in the later years, Billy did several sessions in my studio, and it's always just absolutely incredible to especially for me when he was on organ. Because being an organ player, and let alone someone that really plays the pedals on a B3, which I never did. It just, sensational to watch. To this day, I just love very gifted people and that have developed their gifts, and I'll just sit there and just watch, go out in the room to hear what they're doing, and I'll just sit there and watch them for a while and take it in, because it's beauty. It's a thing of beauty.
So what's it like when you're the mediator between producer and artist? When you're trying to are you trying to interpret two different visions at the same time? Sometimes it's a challenge, to be sure, especially shall we say, if I agree with the artist and the producer is sitting right next to me. So then, I might try to make a suggestion to him that, maybe you should consider this because I think it could be good, that kind of thing. And if I agree with the producer, then it's a lot easier. But I'm not going to be the one to change the tide, so to speak. That's his role. Well, who are some of the more demanding producers you've worked with?
More demanding?
Let's say more difficult to persuade.
Richard Perry. Great, wonderful producer, Richard Perry. He was very headstrong, and I can't say enough about on the positive side. Like all of us, he had some negative side to him for sure. He pushed people really, really hard. You could get a track that was great, and the band would come in and listen, and you're talking about an all-star band of studio musicians. And, listen to it and everyone thinks it's great. And he'd go, good, let's just do one more. And maybe, and he's just trying for something because he wanted options. And there was one time Jeff Vaccaro told me about it. I wasn't recording it at all, but because in the later years when I started producing, I didn't record ever for Richard again. I just did a lot of mixing. But Jeff Recaro told me that there was a time that they came in and listened to the track, and he said, "Okay, let's just do one more." And and he would come up with something, and maybe he would maybe the bass player could do something here, and the piano maybe did a couple of things just to try something else. They went out and they did it. They came in to listen back, and they said, "That's the take." And Richard said, "Yeah, it's a great one, but let's just do one more." And they interrupted him and said, "Richard, that's the take. What's the next song? Period." And they refused to go back out. I loved that.
Was that one of the only times you ever seen that actually, win him over?
Yeah, well, I wasn't there, unfortunately, to see it, but yeah. I was glad that they stood their ground, doggone it.
So I want to just briefly ask you about work you did on anything you did with Miles Davis, because that's obviously very close to my heart. I grew up on jazz, so.
The incredible musician and bass player Marcus Miller and I became friends on, I can't even remember the first album that he was on. I think it was Bob James and David Sanborn, I think, a really cool album that he was on, played a lot on it. And we'd become friends, and that's into the 80s now. That was in that album. Both albums were in the 80s, I guess. Anyway, he had done this Tutu album, a good portion of this Tutu album, where it was, shall we call it, mixed metaphors, to coin a musical phrase, because it was all modern, in the box, loopy stuff and whatnot. And here with the jazz giant that Miles was, and so on. And so it was interesting. And all I did on it was mix for Miles. Miles didn't come, is the sad part. I didn't get to meet him then. And so, and then right after that, I did, and then Amandala was the next one. It's a very similar kind of thing. And I did some of the mixing on that. But I believe in between, Tommy LaPuma, the great jazz producer that I did a lot of records for back then, Miles was doing a summer tour throughout Europe. And so they had decided to do a live album. And so that's when I met Miles, as I went to record it. And it was kind of funny. The first one was one of these little outdoor festivals. And Tommy and Miles are talking when I walk up, and he introduces me to Miles. And the tour manager comes up and says, "Miles, the equipment didn't get here from the States, but I've worked all morning here and I've got almost everything covered." And Miles stops him and says, "I ain't going to do no concert with rented stuff. Cancel the effing thing."
No way.
And he canceled he walked on the show. And we went back to the hotel, and still going up in the elevator, he was still mumbling about how bad it was, that, the disorganization, that how could they not have the equipment here and all that stuff. But anyway, it was the great guitarist Robin Ford was on the bill with him through all those. And it was one of those situations, I've had a couple, I don't understand it exactly, that the album was nothing was ever done with it. It was never mixed until, here we go. This is things that bug Bill Schnee. I'm a huge person for artists' rights. And I can't stand when someone dies and for the most part, I'll call them vultures, come out of the woodwork to start picking up things that the artist never finished, never approved, and they finish them for him. Why? Just to make money, whether it's a record company or whatever. And that Miles tour finally did get mixed by, I believe, the family went in and got it out of the vault and mixed it. And I don't know that I think it did end up on an album. I'm not 100% sure, but that kind of bothers me.
I know exactly what you mean. There were two examples of that didn't sit well. Didn't sit well with me. The one was, Marvin's estate went after the Robin Thicke song "Blurred Lines" very, very hard in 2013. And, one always has to wonder, is that what Marvin would have wanted, his name to be in the media for?
Yeah, I get it. And especially, I mean, it's hard to know because, I have very mixed feelings about that whole thing because taking what you're talking about, Marvin's feelings out of it for a second, because he did rip off the groove without question.
Yes.
I'd be absolutely shocked if they weren't listening to that in the control room, before they put the thing together. But that basically was kind of a landmark case because prior to that, there'd never been, as far as I know, it was the old school version of what you could sue for was so many notes within so many bars that were copied. And that wasn't about notes. It was really just the groove. So it's kind of weird, but your point's well taken as whether Marvin would want to be known for that.
But that issue you raised there just came up recently. We were watching Danny Elfman's masterclass on masterclass.com for film composition. And he recounted an experience where he was on Pee-wee's Big Adventure and there was a sort of a cowboy scene and he used an ocarina that was a bit like Morricone. And the head of music said, "You can't do that." And Elfman said, "Why? I've not done that number of notes." And his supervisor said, "It's not about number of notes, it's about context. If you've got an ocarina against a Western, then it looks like you've copied Morricone." So was that just in the film world that context was what counted, but then, this was the first time it had happened in pop music?
Yeah, as far as I know, this was the first time in pop music. I don't know. That's very interesting, though, about that story you just told.
Yeah, it's I'm sort of I suppose I'm accidentally revealing premium content from masterclass.com, so hopefully they'll come after me. It's only a small soundbite though. But yeah, that was that certainly in the advertising industry that gave us sort of cause for concern because often the request we'll get is here's a track that I like but I can't afford. Can you make something roughly close to it?
Sure.
So
yeah, that goes to two very good friends of mine, Huey Lewis and Ghostbusters, Ray Parker Jr.
Yeah,
where and that, I mean, I wrote about it in the book. So, what can I say? They put the Huey song in the rough cut of the film, and they tried to negotiate a deal to put it in, and it was Huey was hot as a pistol back then, and they wanted too much, and so they couldn't do it. So they gave it. I don't know how it came up that it went to Ray, but they gave the rough cut of the film with the Huey song in it, and said, "Here, write something like this," and those two songs are just a little too close.
Oh, what? So what's the Huey song? I should
Power
be familiar
of Love.
With. Oh, it was meant to be Ghostbusters. Was meant to be Power of Love. I never knew that.
I think that's right. I'd have to hear it now again, but I think that's what it was. Yeah,
well,
and it was funny. I ran into Ray in the car wash when it started, and I said, "Ray, what are you going to do when Huey sues you?" And he said, "He already has." And this is one of those situations. It's kind of funny because Ray had a group that I was introduced to Ray early on, and he is an astounding musician and guitar player. And you look at records I've produced. If it was possible, I always had Ray on a session because he would come up with incredible ideas. I love. My favorite thing is head charts, putting a bunch of guys in the room together and everybody chipping in and coming up with ideas. There's nothing better than that. And I would always have him on a session. And the good news is they settled out of court, and for a lot of money. Not as much as they would have, Huey was on the road. The guys were on the road, so they couldn't take time to go to court. They would have gotten a lot more if they'd gone to court, I think. But they did settle. And Ray had a band before he was a solo artist called Radio, and take off on his name, Raydio. And they had a couple of hits for sure. But, Ghostbusters made him a household name, and to this day. So,
yeah, I mean, I still, there's a time and a place for records like that are absolutely right, and it's one of those where everyone loves that record in their heart, even if they won't say it. I think. So we're just coming up on an hour here. So I'd like to see if we can just get your thoughts on one more thing before we wrap up. And I'm wondering if you keep up with, contemporary music that not exactly is in the charts now, but that's popular currently.
Not as much as I used to, but yes.
And what do you hear? What do you think about what's going on? The trends for sampling and, taking audio files and manipulating them rather than playing music in?
Well, did I go in kicking and screaming? I don't know. I can't remember that far back. I love that. Look, I knew early on that I didn't want to be the best buggy whip maker. I think about the guy that was making buggy whips at the turn of the last century, 1900s, and he had 2 generations. His father and grandfather made the best buggy whips, and if it had the last name Johnson, you knew that it was the best buggy whip you could buy. Until one day when everyone wanted a car, no one cared about buggy whips anymore. So there's no question that the art form of music and recorded music and everything was going to change. So I thought early on, I'm not going to make the best buggy whip and be sitting alone. So I definitely have stayed with it in terms of a lot of things, mixing a lot of things, especially. But I just, for the first time, right before the pandemic, started producing a girl where first time I've ever done everything in the box. The only microphone that was used was on her voice. And with some friends, guys that are really good with loops and sampling and stuff. Mm-hmm. And, coming up, I sat with the songwriters and came up with kind of the way Boz would write when I worked with Boz Scaggs. We came up with chord changes and kind of grooves that moved her. And then she went off and wrote melodies and lyrics to what we had. And I really enjoyed it. It was really a blast. We have 5 things done, and I'm anxious now that things are breaking up with the pandemic. I'm very anxious to get back to finishing that. So I thought it was great fun.
Well, that's really encouraging, and it was certainly not the answer I was expecting. So I take it you think you'll be making music one way or another for the rest of your life until the last day.
Absolutely. You don't mention the R word to me because it's a curse word, retirement. I said early on that I want to drop over on the console. It'll be something like hit the talkback. Guys, I'm pretty sure the second verse.
And that was Bill Schnee.
And they'll have to come in and deal with, the dead Schnee. But yeah, I want to be making music as long as anyone will let me. And if they stop letting me, I'll still do it.
What a great note to go out on. Bill Schnee, the book is Chairman at the Board, and I presume it's available online and at good bookstores everywhere?
Yeah, I don't know England what's like, but here it's Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, wherever, but Amazon for sure.
Great stuff. Bill, I really hope we can talk again. I mean, hopefully I can come over to the US and we can talk for real because, I've only been to New York and DC and, the West Coast is calling at some point. So,
okay. I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Have a great day.